50 young fellas are chosen, and each of them knows being chosen is an honor. Even if their faces don't quite convey that, the challenge is about as straightforward as it gets. You just walk. Except it's not quite that straightforward because nothing truly honorable ever is, right? You have to walk at least 3 miles an hour. You can't stop for the bathroom. You can't stop to tie your shoe. You can't stop. These boys have been chosen to walk until they're the last boy walking, or they're shot dead. For us in the audience, it feels like we're watching some kind of dark dystopian fantasy, but when you figure out what the long walk's actually about, you might wonder why any of them feel honored at all. In this video, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. They don't know why they feel honored either. If you've already seen The Long Walk, you might have found the tone a bit peculiar and maybe even weird at times. Coming from the man that brought us The Hunger Games and I Am Legend and one of my personal favorites, Constantine, it's no surprise the characters in this movie are relatable and interesting and compelling, but you might have been surprised at how stripped down the surroundings were. This entire hour and 48-minute runtime takes place on a single barren road, and when you know what that road symbolizes, you'll understand it's the only setting the story really needed. In fact, you could argue it's the only setting any movie really needs, but I'm probably getting ahead of myself. A lot of the best horrors and thrillers appear to be about one thing, but are actually about something else. And the deeper, richer meaning within those films, or their true meaning, is often found within that something else. By holding a fictional mirror up to our non-fictional lives, well-written allegorical movies like The Long Walk can provide us with a story we can watch and a truth we can feel. One of my favorite examples of this sort of story is The Babadook. On its surface, it's an extremely well-written and superbly acted monster movie. But the story's real punch comes from what the Babadook actually represents. When you stop seeing it as a well-dressed, shifty specter lurking somewhere in Amelia Vanek's periphery, and start seeing it as a physical manifestation of the trauma and repressed emotions caused by the untimely death of her husband, it transcends mere monster movie conventions and becomes symbolic of something most of us, unfortunately, will have to battle in our own homes at some point. Ari Aster's Hereditary is another excellent example. The film uses demonic possession and cult imagery as metaphors for the unavoidable and often devastating reality that we are prisoners of our own genetics and upbringings. Today's movie, The Long Walk, is set in an alternate American future, although not necessarily an impossible one after yesterday's election result in New York City. I digress. It's 19 years after an unnamed war tore the great nation of America apart. The first character we focus on is Raymond Garrity, or Ray, played by Cooper Hoffman, the son of the late great Philip Seymour Hoffman, who was my favorite actor. Judy Greer plays Ray's mother, Ginny. She doesn't appear a lot in the story, but when she is on screen, stripped down and raw in her motherly hyperventilating, she's likely to rip your heart out. The car radio is barking communist propaganda, which adds to the uncanniness when you hear it's an American voice barking it. The economy has collapsed, and the strangeness I mentioned earlier begins right away, when we're told these 50 young men walk every year to help inspire patriotism and work ethic among the nation's destitute. Only one young man will win. He receives untold riches and a single wish for literally anything he wants. The other 49 will die brutally in front of the rest of their new friends, and in front of the nation, who watches the event from the comfort of their living room televisions. We aren't shown a lot of the story world beyond the road's painted white boundaries, and instead, we're shown fragments of it. And that's because Francis Lawrence wanted us to understand this world by feeling it through the performances of these young men. At the starting line, after a difficult-to-watch mother and son goodbye, Ray meets Pete McVries, played by British actor David Johnson, who's fresh off an impressive performance in Alien Romulus. There's also Billy Stebbins, played by Garrett Waring, Art Baker, played by Tut Nyot, Hank Olson, played by Ben Wang, Joshua Ojic as Collie Parker, Gary Barkovich, played by Charlie Plummer, and the man in charge of literally everything in this world, the Major, played by Mark Hamill. The tone during this opening setup is also strange. These boys have never met, they are in direct competition with each other, and they're about to embark on a journey they probably won't come back from. And yet, there's a camaraderie between them, and you can feel it. Each of these main characters serve to exemplify some broader behavioral traits, but we'll talk about them more later on. This movie's real story happens between our two main characters, Ray Garrity and Peter McVries. They hit it off right away, and they spend the entire film exchanging views and bonding through the intense shared experience. But despite the outward appearance, they've clicked immediately. Without knowing it, they both arrived at the starting line that morning in philosophical opposition. One of these story world fragments we are shown beyond the road involves Ray's father. He's a man of principles, and he encourages Ray to think critically and independently. This involves criticizing and even opposing the Major's oppressive regime. Exactly 1 hour into this movie, Ray helps us understand the real cost of rebellion in this world when he recalls the night the Major visited his home. When word of his father's dissenting behavior got to the authorities, likely through somebody more submissive reporting him, the Major drags him out of his home and shoots him for refusing to pledge allegiance. This demonstrates the extent of the authoritarianism while simultaneously explaining Ray's motivation for joining the long walk. He's there to take out the Major if he can get close enough to him by winning. To add some spice to his already savory retribution recipe, Ray plans on requesting one of the soldiers' rifles as his prize so he can shoot the Major on the spot as the entire nation is watching on. When Ray declares his intentions to Pete, he assumes Pete's going to understand him and support him, but if he had, there would be no movie here. Pete disagrees with Ray's revenge plan because he disagreed with his father's decision to give up his life for his beliefs. Pete can't understand why Ray's father would choose to die, and Ray can't understand why Pete can't understand it. They are in diametric opposition on this subject, exactly the way most of society would be, which is not a coincidence. And as I'm going to try and demonstrate, this rich philosophical contrast between them, their opposing ideological responses to the meaningless oppression and despair of this story world, is the point of this movie. As a young, naive shell of it, Garrity represents his father, and his father represents rebellion and idealism. He stands for moral resistance at any cost, and he dies for his ideals, which sounds great on paper or in a movie, but his choice raises crucial questions, such as, is an ideal actually worth anything if it ultimately leaves your entire family alone and destroyed? Is uncompromising moral integrity worth more than your actual life? Ray inherits this dilemma. His father's defiance becomes his inspiration and simultaneously his burden, although he won't realize the latter until it's way too late. Spoiler alert, all that matters right now is that he's compelled to avenge his father's death, and that is why he's joined the walk. As a result, his worldview is the world is irretrievably broken, the only way to fix it is with radical defiance, and I am the person to do it because he was my father. Now, his notion is a noble one, but it's also naive and self-consuming, and in this specific scenario, it's also kind of dumb. The system he's so set on destroying wants him to want to destroy it so it can turn him into a spectacle to help rile up next year's participants.
Shut up!
That's the spirit, my boy!
Peter McVries, on the other hand, is the opposite. He represents acceptance and absurd optimism. He's had a very different life than Ray. He was orphaned and left to fend for himself, sleeping where he could and eating what he could find, whereas Ray doesn't look like someone who's known hunger. The giant scar on Pete's face is a symbol of trauma and struggle, and after being beaten down and scarred and abandoned, he's chosen to put his own meaning into all of life's little moments. And when you understand this to be Pete's perspective, you also understand to him, Ray is doing the exact opposite. He's filling life's little moments up with vengeance and anger. Now, before you start thinking, geez, Stephen King had a thing or two to say even back in his college days, he's actually borrowed Pete's outlook directly from French-Algerian philosopher and political activist Albert Camus. Camus believed the human condition's a contradiction between our desire for meaning and the universe's meaningless silence. This view is known as absurdism, and Camus is credited with establishing it.
Seriously? What happened to Jonny Recaps?
Sorry. In plain English, as humans, we have no purpose, but we really, really want one. And absurdists believe one way to find purpose is to live in the present and put everything you've got into every single passing moment. They believe that's how you find joy and beauty everywhere, even in the simple act of washing dishes. And if you think that sounds silly, I would suggest giving it a try next time your sink's full. Completely clear your head of everything and focus only on making each dish as clean as you can get it. You might be surprised at where your head ends up. I know I was. So, in summary, where Ray believes the world is irretrievably broken, Pete believes you can't beat the system because it's too big, you can only control your own perspective, and you can always choose to smile even when you're walking through hell. Another way to summarize it, Garrity joins the walk believing you should die for meaning, and Pete joins the walk with a smile knowing everything is meaningless. And if you're thinking one side makes more sense than the other side, you have to consider the reality both sides have pros and cons. After all, if one philosophy was a clear winner every time, philosophers would all have to get real jobs. In this race specifically, Ray uses his rebellion to fuel his moral courage. It gives him purpose and drive, but it also blinds him to the real costs of picking up his father's obsessions. And Pete's smiling optimism might give him the appearance of inner peace, but his approach is also dangerously close to being considered complacency, otherwise known as surrender. This is why their friendship matters, and this is why their views are front and center literally and figuratively throughout this movie. At the 1 hour 20-minute point, Ray sees his mother, and he realizes he actually rejects what his father's instilled in him. The image of her by herself on the side of the road is a stark reminder he's abandoned her for his cause, which is actually his father's cause. And so, by extension, he understands his father did the same thing to him and his mother. This scene shows us Pete's perspective has changed Ray's perspective. His character has grown as a result of meeting Pete, but unfortunately, it has happened too late. By the end of the walk, when only the two of them remain, Ray realizes he can't win, because as a young man with integrity, he knows he entered the walk for the wrong reasons. And just as we think that's the ending, we see Pete has actually grown in equal proportion to Ray, but in the opposite direction. He recognizes the value in calculated, measured resistance. And in light of what's just transpired, he understands his grinning optimism isn't always the appropriate response. And he completes his story arc by shooting the major and dedicating it to Ray. His decision to keep walking after he's won speaks to our collective decision to acknowledge our alarm clocks every single morning and to get up and to keep going, not as an act of rebellion or complacency, but an acknowledgement of our acceptance of the human condition without any ideologies guiding us. This was a story of two young men thrust together in tense, dire circumstances. They formed an unlikely friendship despite those circumstances. They grew mutually as a result of that friendship, and they had the friendship ripped apart by a bullet. As I'm sure you picked up, the road in this film is life. Stephen King wrote this book in 1966 during the height of the Vietnam War. This story is an allegory for that generation's unimaginable sacrifices. The peculiar opening tone feels less peculiar when you imagine these boys congregating thousands of miles from home on the shores of Vietnam under the gaudy banner of patriotism and the promise of some vague, bright, shiny future. Hank Olson starts this story full of bravado. He's the kind of guy you'd bet on to win, but as the miles drag on, his swagger drains away, and it's replaced by panic and defeat. He represents the idea strength is only ever temporary, and that even the toughest of us can crack under pressure, especially when we're young. Gary Barkovich is the agitator. He taunts, and he mocks, and he provokes like a classic villain, but eventually, his act wears thin, and beneath it, there's only fear. He's a kid using cruelty as armor. Gary embodies how easily survival can turn young folks against each other when they are thrown into the real world completely unprepared. And finally is the Major. He's distant and unreadable. His voice is calm and cold behind the aviators. Mark Hamill plays him with eerie restraint, making him less a man and more of a symbol. He's the faceless authority demanding obedience while pretending to stand for freedom and pretending to care about the lives of these young men. In the 1960s, America told these boys to feel proud. In fact, they insisted on it, under punishment of imprisonment and even death in extreme cases. So, being young and impressionable and undoubtedly encouraged by their own fathers, the boys went, without ever really understanding what they were supposed to be so proud of. And they died in the tens of thousands at the average age of 23. This movie's done very well in Rotten Tomatoes land, but I imagine its success is more about the movie's brilliant performances than anything to do with the source material's deeper meaning. And that's not a criticism, it's more a reminder things have changed so much that meaning in modern movies has lost a lot of its meaning. Most audiences aren't here to debate moral integrity or generational sacrifice. They are here to be moved and to feel something while they're escaping real life for a couple of hours. Even I felt compelled to excuse my subscribers from watching this video when it dawned on me it might be misconstrued as philosophical controversial or, heaven forbid, thought-provoking. I would argue you'd have a hell of a time getting anybody in 2025 to genuinely agree that uncompromising moral integrity is worth more than life itself. A lot of people might say it, especially if there's a camera on them, but those are often the same people who scream about open borders while refusing to give an unvetted migrant a folding cot in their basement. But I think that contradiction is exactly why the long walk still matters. Strip away the camouflage uniforms and the sideline applause and the rhetoric, and what you're left with are young people trying to find the balance between endurance and purpose. Ray and Pete embodied both halves of that struggle in defiance and acceptance, and yet they both ended up walking the same lonely road together, and they'll both eventually die on it. Nearly 60 years later, maybe this story isn't suggesting we choose between the two options anymore. Maybe it's suggesting we try seeing the road for what it really is. A heartless, unfeeling, uncaring stretch of time that's going to devour our ideals, whatever we choose them to be, inherited or otherwise. And maybe, seen in that light, this 2025 remake ceases to be some watered-down allegory for Vietnam. It becomes a warning for any generation told to march towards something it doesn't understand or agree with. In closing, on a personal note, I loved this movie because it made me think. Not so much about the poetry of a long, lonely road or even about the walking itself and what that might represent. It made me think of something a bit deeper. When the screen cut to black, a single question lingered for me. In this day and age, is there really anything worth walking for anymore? And since then, what stayed with me isn't the possible answers to that question, it's the fact I'm even asking it in the first place. I'm away to wash some dishes. Until next time, folks,